Hello, it's so lovely to have you here today. This is the 14th video in my year-long series where I am making a piece of mixed media art each week or so, inspired by one or more of the books on my Arty bookshelf. This week's episode is a little bit different. Instead of being inspired by my books, I let my book choices be inspired by what I was doing this week. Sketch Your World is one of several urban sketching books that I have in my collection, and the urban sketchers believe in creating a visual record of the world around us by sketching live on location wherever you happen to be. So no photographs back in your studio. You sit wherever you are and draw what you see in front of you. And I really like this book because it has a variety of styles in it, and not all of the sketches are hyper-realistic photograph-like carbon copies of the world around us. They're quite experimental and varied in their approach, and that suits my style really well. At the beginning of April, I treated myself to a short Arty getaway to Gabriola Island. Gabriola is a small rural island off the coast of British Columbia here. The book has a section on travel sketching, and I have been travel sketching for years, actually 10 years this year. So the second book that I chose is this photographic essay of the beautiful province where I live, and it's just full of gorgeous, gorgeous pictures of British Columbia. And the reason that I chose this one is that there's a few photographs from Gabriola Island, the island that I visited. And there's specifically a couple of things that relate to my story here. This unusual looking tree here is something called an arbutus tree, and I'll tell you a little bit more about it later. But first, let me tell you about this interesting looking place. It's called Malaspina Galleries, and it's one of the places that you get told to visit on Gabriola Island, and it looks something like this. The sea has carved away the sandstone to make it look like a crashing wave in the ocean. But then here's another look. I did a little bit of research before I went to the island, and this is something that I did not see in any of my research. And here's another view of that phenomenon. Now, I'm told that this is not something that happens all the time. You have to be there when the weather and the climatic conditions are right. I have a friend who told me when she visited, the place was full of graffiti. It was wet, cold, rainy, and miserable. It was not my experience at all. This place was sheer magic. And because I was there off season, I had the place to myself, so I spent a good amount of time lying back on the shelf here, just admiring the view on the ceiling, the view off to the side. It was so wonderful on that warm, sunny afternoon that I happened to be there, and not planned at all. It was just happy coincidence. And look at the water. Look at the lights there dancing on the water. Can it be more beautiful? So the excuse for my trip, the reason for my trip, is something called the Isle of the Arts Festival. This is an annual event that happens on the island, and there's a series of events and performances and workshops. And I signed up for 3 workshops while I was there, and making this journal was one of the workshops. It's not quite finished yet. I'm still working on it. The workshop was called Spellbound. I decided to use the journal as a record of my trip to the island. And I'll tell you about these little bits here a little bit later on, how they came to be. But there's my sketch of me waiting in line at the ferry terminal. And here's another sketch that I did while I was on the island, and I think it looks quite cool here next to the postcard, which was a gift from the host at the Airbnb where I stayed. And this was the beach that was my inspiration for my sketch. And here I am adding some watercolor to my sketch there. And while I was sketching, a little girl came up behind me and we had a little bit of a chat.
Hello, how are you?
Good.
That's good.
I'm going swimming.
Wow, you're brave. Isn't it cold?
No, it's not that cold.
No?
It's colder on the other beach.
Oh, yeah. I noticed it was colder over there.
Did you check that beach?
I went over there and it was too cold to even sit there.
There's a warmer rock. There's a warmer rock.
Is there?
And there you have it, an insider tip. FYI, this is the other beach. They're called twin beaches. They're separated by a little grassy strip and they face in opposite directions. Personally, I don't see a warm rock there. Here's one of the handouts that I got in the grimoire workshop. And there's a map off the upper part of the island where I spent most of my time, and you can see there the little bit of land where the two beaches face in opposite direction. There's a couple of more pieces of art by the host at the Airbnb, a couple of interesting magazine collages that I like the way they go together, and there's another one of Deb's pieces. She calls them little gems, and this is where those little shapes came from the sketch that I did on the ferry. They're wayfinding icons that they used to help lost people find their way back to the stairwell that leads them to their car. Another one of Deb's art pieces, and a sketch off the view from my guest room that I stayed in. And you gotta like a place that greets you with this when you arrive at the front gate there. And here's another greeter there who's checking out my stash of vintage lace that I found at the Gabe store, one of the two secondhand stores on the island. And here's the other secondhand store on the island. It's called GIRO. And here are some gems that I found inside at GIRO. And I left them on the shelf. I do not need more stuff in my stash, but I thought these were pretty cool for whoever ends up taking them home. And here are some more bits. I have plans for that postcard there, and some more of the things that I picked up on the island. Now, the second workshop that I did was Sowing the Seeds for a Wonderful Life, and this was quite different in style. And we did some writing, we did some collage, and this was a piece that I made during the workshop, sort of combining two of the different activities, and I had to cut it down to fit in my book. But don't worry, I will do more work on it, and some of the other bits that I had torn out of magazines, I wanted to save them, so I put them in my journal as well. And I am definitely inspired by color themes. And this is another of the writing activities we did using our dominant and non-dominant hands. And this one, an unusual color combination for me, but I thought it was odd that I picked out all of those colors. Another of my sketches that I did from the Surf Lodge pub, looking out at this view while I ate my lunch one day. Another one of their eateries on the island is the Mad Rona coffee bar. I have to admit, it took me a while to get the connection. And I'll tell you about that in just a minute. And here I am doing a sketch at that colder of the two twin beaches, where I sat in my car in my warm winter jacket. And this was the view that I was sketching from my car there. And the tree on the left is what we call here in BC an arbutus tree. And the alternate name for it is a madrona. So get it? Madrona, Mad Rona. And this little book gets an honorable mention this week because it's got some sweet little stories about the arbutus tree that I'll share with you as I sketch. So here I am, as I said, sitting in my car trying to stay warm. It was really quite cold out that day. I start out with these Crayola twistable crayons. Yes, they are children's art tools, but it amuses me to use imperfect tools to create beautiful art. And if you're wondering what the heck is that paper that I'm working on, well, what it is thin rice paper glued onto a tourist map off the Yukon, because I had those things and I did not want to throw them away. Let's see what Plants of Coastal British Columbia has to say about the arbutus tree. The Straight Salish of Vancouver Island sometimes cook the reddish papery bark with camas bulbs to color them pink. I also read somewhere that the berries in the bark are high in tannins, so lots of potential for dye experiments there. I wish I had read this before I went. I might have taken some things to try dyeing there. Well, I'll have to go back again. There's also a Straight Salish myth that goes as follows. Pitch, and pitch is the sappy tar-like stuff that some trees have. Pitch used to go fishing before the sun rose and then retire to the shade before it became strong. One day he was late and had just reached the beach when he melted. Other people rushed to share him. Douglas Fir arrived first and secured most of the pitch, which he poured over his head and body. Grand Fir obtained only a little, and by the time Arbutus arrived, there was none left. Therefore, Arbutus has no pitch to this day. Once I finished scribbling about with the crayons, I've switched over to this cheap set of watercolor paints, and I'm just now blobbing them on. And there's another story that was told by late Chief Philip Paul of the Saanich people. Arbutus was the tree used by the survivors of the Great Flood, a tradition common to all of the Northwest Coast peoples, to anchor their canoe to the top of Mount Newton. To this day, the Saanich people do not burn arbutus in their stoves because of the important service the tree provided long ago. And there is my finished piece after it's dried, and I've added some of my subtext to it. And if you want to know about the subtext, go back and watch some of my previous videos and I'll explain. And if you hang around to the end of this video, I'll tell you about another sweet little personal connection with the plant book. Now, the third workshop that I did was a collagraph printing technique. Now, a collagraph is like a texture collage that you make to create the printing plate. And I used the view from my room at my Airbnb and this lamp that I sketched when I was at the surf lodge as my inspiration to create my plates. And here's another one of Juanita's handouts. She said they look like some crazy old woman made them. And then she went, oh yeah, crazy old women did make them. And here's the first of my prints. And I made it so that the two pieces fit together. And those two little shapes that I made from the sketch that I did on the ferry, those also became printing plates that I used to layer up my collages here. And just like that, my trip to Gabriola Island was over. On the way back, I met up with a friend of mine in Nanaimo, and 2 ferry rides later, I was back home. And that's it for this video. Thanks for watching, and I'm so happy to have you here. Hope to see you again soon. And the story about the book. So as I was flipping through, I noticed that there were these photos of the authors on the back, and this name caught my attention. My daughter had a friend at university who had a similar last name, and indeed, his parents were both professors at Simon Fraser University, and yep, that's his dad. And I can't help wondering if that's baby George in the photo, but